The next one, we're going for some bling. Antony's going to give you a talk about the treasure trove. So, there we go.
There are too many promises about shiny things.
Oh, go away then.
Warning there, there's copper alloy in there. Fantastic, good afternoon. This afternoon I will be talking to you about treasure trove in Edinburgh, the Lothians and the borders. What I'm going to do is start by saying a little bit about treasure trove as a process, say a little bit about the treasure trove unit itself, because as you may know there have been some changes in the composition of treasure trove, including myself. I'm pleased to say this is my first public talk about treasure trove since joining. And then I'm going to get on to some vaguely blingy things. There will be a little bit of a show and tell of just some more significant objects that have been through the treasure trove process in the last decade or so from Edinburgh, the Lothians and the borders. So one thing I should say is, obviously we get a really wide variety of finds coming through treasure trove, and in a short talk it's very, very difficult to convey a sense of the scope and scale that we have. And equally, it's not enough time to really go into detail for the importance of some of the more significant finds and to really give them the credit they're due. So hopefully I'm tracking a neat little course through the middle and getting to the middle of those. So what actually is treasure trove? Some of you may know this, some of you may have heard this and be sick to death of it, but we do feel the need just to beat the drum a little bit. Treasure trove is based on the Scottish common law principle of bona vacantia, meaning ownerless goods. So basically, the Crown, under Scots law, can lay claim to any ownerless property, which includes portable antiquities, and indeed archaeological finds do become the predominant material that the treasure trove unit deals with. The Crown's representative in Scotland is what's known as the KLTR, the King's and Lord Treasurer's Remembrancer. You will occasionally hear us slipping back into referring to it as the QLTR as things slip. As you might imagine, this had a rebranding last year. But we're just about getting used to returning to that name. This idea of ownerless property, and indeed the very definition of treasure, the idea that under Scots law anything can technically be treasure trove, does sometimes come into conflict with the slightly better known English and Welsh Treasure Act. It's a good thing that the English and Welsh Treasure Act is as well known as it is. It gets a lot of media coverage, and of course that system is based on a definition of treasure of anything over 300 years old, more than 10% gold or silver, and then certain combinations of coin hoards and prehistoric hoards count as treasure as well. But of course that doesn't apply in Scotland. Everything is potentially treasure trove if it's ownerless. But that does cause some communication problems with us, because the English and Welsh system often gets generically applied to the whole of the country. So this is why we try and bang this drum to say, no, things are different up here, particularly in the borders, particularly in Dumfries and Galloway, where we get particularly metal detectorists travelling up from England, letting them realise that when they've crossed the border they have moved into a different legal system for the reporting of fines. So this is a communication issue, that's something that we do want to keep building on. So we're looking at any object that's once been owned and whose original owner cannot now be known or traced, and this only applies to human-made material, not natural material. So any bits of animal bone, human bone, geology don't count as treasure. And again, this might seem like a fairly simple definition. There are interesting edge cases that can test this and test the legal definition, and we do rely on legal support sometimes for these cases. For example, if there's a rock in a field, a glacial erratic that's been there for a good 100,000 years or so, and somebody in the Neolithic happened to carve some ring and dot decoration on it, how do we consider that as owned property? Is it portable property? What if it's on a stone that somebody could physically lift? How do we engage with concepts of ownership back in the Neolithic? Can we say it was ever owned by anybody at the time? So it can get a little bit complicated at times, and say occasionally we have a bit of a tricky legal path to navigate. And then finally, it needs to have been found in Scotland, which obviously seems fairly obvious. But again, because of a lot of the very active online trade in antiquities and objects, it's still a box that we've got to make sure that we tick. Things do move around, people do find things in Scotland, and they can even change hands before they get reported to us. So the tracing of provenance is something that, again, can sometimes cause us problems, and it needs to be something that we're sure about. So the treasure trove unit itself, Through most of its life, certainly in the last decade, the Treasure Trove unit has consisted of 2 people. And I think it's fair to say that that's never been sufficient to manage the number of finds that have come in. It's absolutely not been in more recent years, because certainly over the last decade the number of metal detector users in Scotland has risen considerably, and particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic we've seen significant backlogs start to arise. This is partly because the team at the time really weren't able to get into their office for about 2 years, and obviously recording finds you can do to some extent remotely, but not easily. So there was a long period of time that people were out making finds that weren't able to be recorded. And secondly, we actually think we had a lot more people taking up the hobby of metal detecting during lockdown. It was an activity that people could legally get out and do during the strictest lockdown. So we think, and we're still trying to quantify, how many people that may have been, but we know there's been a significant uptake. So we have backlogs to deal with. Anybody who's dealt with Treasure Trove in the last few years, I'm sure will know that we have some of these issues. The positive spin is that we now have a few more people to deal with it. The Treasure Trove unit is now as large as it's ever been, I think it's fair to say, in its history. To give a little quantification of finds, actually, I should say, we did a bit of a calculation. This year to date, we think we've taken in something like 13,000 new finds from across Scotland to deal with. That is more in previous years, and the one thing we're trying to quantify is how many more of the finds made during lockdown that actually accounts for. Because we end up inevitably being a little bit reactive. We can't know what somebody's found and not told us about, but we do kind of have to predict how many finds that might be so we can plan for the future. So that becomes a fun process, but we know we have a lot of finds. And in the next year or two, I'll come on to the staff in just a second and say what we're doing, but we are trying to be much more active again in the next year, 2 years particularly. We're getting out to set up finds days at museums across the country, so hopefully we will be able to meet some of these new detectorists to start explaining the system, make sure they're aware of who we are and what they need to do. We can start returning finds to people to get them out of our way when they've been processed, gather new finds in. We can be a lot more visible and a lot more proactive. So the team as it stands at the minute, Emily Freeman, the Treasure Trove manager, some of you, even many of you may know from her time at the museum and getting a lot of our current systems in place. My colleague Sophie Flynn, who started in early 2021, so she's a Treasure Trove lockdown baby, if you want to call it that way. Myself on the other side, I only started 2 months ago, as I mentioned. We formed the new permanent Treasure Trove team. And then we have, at the bottom there, smiling happily, George Prue, Dr. Janelle Fontaine and Carl Savage, who are with us on 18-month contracts. They started at the same time as me, so we're all learning this process together. But they're very much in place to help us deal with some of those backlogs and get things on a much firmer footing for the future. So as I say, more of us than ever before, and hopefully we're going to be more visible than ever before in getting things done and moved on. So positive times ahead. So to turn to some finds. What I've done to try and kind of structure this a little bit, because there's a variety of finds potentially to show, so I've just grouped them into 2 broad categories, one on power and belief and one on connectivity. So to have a look at a few finds broadly connected with issues of power and belief from the area. Starting with this rather lovely late Bronze Age gold penannular ring, commonly known as lock rings, this one from Churnside. I've made the fatal classic mistake of not putting a scale bar on this photograph. This is not one-to-one. It's basically, in real life, it's just under 3 centimetres in diameter, weighs about 6 grams, so very small, delicate little object. When this one was found in 2009, it was only the 10th example known from Scotland, so not common finds anywhere, particularly not common finds in Scotland, and it was the first example of this type of find that had been made in 70 years at the time as well, so caused quite a stir on that front as well. They're often given the name lock rings. There's been historic dispute and conversation about what they were actually used for, whether they were forms of currency, whether they were strung onto gold bars, whether they made noise, things like that. The current leading interpretation at the minute seems to be that they were used as hair ornaments, so fastened into the hair as very visible symbols of power and wealth and status. They are hollow, I should point out. You can see just the manufacture, hopefully, that there's one sheet of gold at the top here, another comparable sheet of gold underneath, and then this third sheet plate here forming a triangular section, and then this one actually has a little beaded edge running all the way around. So they are quite light, delicate objects. They're certainly not structural in any way, shape or form. So yeah, hair ornaments being the leading current thought on those, I think. Alex and Sheridan may tell me I'm wrong on that at some point. Discuss later. Second item to mention, moving on to an Iron Age object, this rather gorgeous copper alloy enamelled strap junction from near Dunbar. Strap junction, as the name suggests, the point where two straps come together, this time on a horse's harness. So behind these end plates here, there's a bar on each side where the straps can just be attached. Probably originally formed part of a full set, perhaps matching set other objects with this same decorative scheme, so a rather grand and ostentatious presentation of horse fittings and equipment. This one, however, was found inside a known Iron Age enclosure, and the feeling on this is that it was probably not a casual loss, but was probably a deliberate deposition. So there's a nice juxtaposition there between the kind of the wealth and the status and the ostentation of this being worn as part of a horse harness set, but equally the power and the influence to relinquish something of that sort of value, to bury in the ground as part of a communicative strategy with the supernatural, presumably for the benefit of the community. So it's a sort of object that through its appearance and its use in life, but then also its decommissioning and burial, we can consider different aspects of power and authority and control. A find that you might all be familiar with, the Cranmer Lioness. I'm sure you've all seen this at some point in the past. Obviously, a reminder that not only metal finds go through Treasure Trove, that we do deal with all kinds of materials. As I'm sure you'll know, found in 1997 by a ferryman in the muds of the mouth of the River Armand at Cramond, and probably originating as part of a very grand funerary monument, probably for a high-status Roman official, maybe based at the fort at Cramond. The symbolism on the lioness is very much about death and rebirth and the fragility of life, the idea that at any moment you may be mauled by a lioness, that fragility. The base of the sculpture does have snakes on it as well, so they're very strong symbols in the classical world of rebirth and of the soul, so this cyclical life and death. What's particularly interesting about this one is that the figure being eaten by the lion seems to be a captive of some kind. He seems to be one of these Roman depictions of barbarian populations, and in this instance it's been speculated perhaps this does represent a local Caledonian. So people viewing this monument when it was set up in all its pomp and grandeur as a funerary monument may have taken very different messages from it. People from the Roman fort seeing it may have taken some of these messages of the cycles of life and death and rebirth. Somebody slightly more local to the area seeing it may have taken a more pointed message from it, perhaps as pointed as the teeth on the lioness. But that idea, different people viewing objects in the past, seeing them in different ways and reading different messages from them. But of course, interactions between the Roman military and the Roman state and native populations weren't always just about mauling people and eating them. Here we have, from Howick, a copper alloy wine dipper. Would have existed as part of a set. These things come as part of a dipper and a strainer set as a classical way of serving wine at the dining table. But this actually comes from very close to a settlement that doesn't seem to show any signs of other Roman involvement, so we think this is something that's perhaps passed from Roman hands into a native settlement. So maybe gift-giving, maybe an element of bribery. Perhaps, though, of course, a native population or a native individual who were quite willing and keen to take on these new, more exotic ways of eating and drinking and table manners. It doesn't always have to be forced. There may have been people willing to adopt these new ideas. But of course we can't ever really know whether the use of these objects in this new native context actually matched what the original Roman maker of the object envisaged for them. In new cultural contacts, these objects can take on new meanings and new uses. On a similar vein, we could perhaps suggest something like that for this copper alloy statuette of Minerva found near Kelso, which the area around Kelso is fairly replete with Roman activity. There's no shortage of Roman material to be found in the area. But the statuette was found in a more isolated area, no other particular finds around. It's been suggested maybe it relates to the site of a temple or a sanctuary that we haven't found. I don't think that necessarily needs to be the case. We have plenty of evidence across Britain and the northwestern provinces of quite isolated burials of religious offerings. So I think it's more interesting to maybe see this as, if this was buried by somebody of Roman identity, how were they engaging with the landscape they encountered? If they were in a strange and alien landscape to them, how were they perceiving the spiritual nature of that landscape? Where was a suitable place to bury an offering such as this, and how were they engaging with the landscape they were encountering. But of course that's not to necessarily say, a bit like we mentioned with the wine dipper, that this does represent the act of a Roman, even though this is the classical deity Minerva in all her classical loveliness. Minerva does seem to have been quite an adaptable deity. Certainly the imagery of Minerva was quite adaptable. We have evidence right across Britain of other deities being portrayed as Minerva. So you may remember from a few years ago, I think it was 2002, down in Ashwell in Hertfordshire, there was a votive assemblage there found which produced evidence of a new deity for Roman Britain, the goddess Sununa. The British Museum has that assemblage and has it on display. But Sununa, as she appeared in that assemblage, was entirely Minerva. There are beautiful gold plaques that were produced with the image of Minerva in a temple, but the name at the bottom punched on says Deo Sununa, to the god Sununa, but the imagery, as I say, is entirely Mercury. And the excavators, when they were studying the material, expected to see the name of Mercury, Minerva when they were doing it. So it's a very adaptable set of imagery. From Birrens, we have the stone relief in the National Museum of Scotland depicting Brigantia, the northern native deity, again appearing entirely as Minerva. If it wasn't for an inscription, we'd think that that was the deity being deified and being worshipped. So where we find statuettes and things like this, I'm not suggesting for a second that we should automatically assume that they're not the classical deity being portrayed, but we need to bear in mind there's a possibility that when different people are looking at this imagery and using this imagery, they're not always thinking of the classical gods in the way we might expect them to now. So interesting little finds for maybe thinking about the way that material culture changes hands and changes context as it moves through different populations and communities. Move on to some slightly more recent religious material. Some of the finds that we get very, very regularly through the treasure trove unit are medieval finds with Christian motifs on them, so either inscriptions or imagery. On the left here, this gilded copper alloy strap end, obviously it's lost a lot of the gilding, sadly. Hopefully you can imagine that it would have been quite the thing in its heyday. Dating to the 15th century, and unusual for the full-scale face of Christ that appears on it. So you can see the little chubby-cheeked Christ who's appearing on there. Possibly representing a bespoke commission by somebody, and found at Crichton, but actually found approximately halfway between the castle and the church at Crichton. So maybe we can speculate, lost by somebody of a certain status, maybe connected, and travelling between the two, perhaps when this was lost and fell off. On the other side, a silver ring with a blue glass setting, that I'll return to in a moment, and an inscription around the outside that you can't see on this photo, but saying Jesus Nazar, and various versions of the longer form inscription, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Iudiorum, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, is something we see all the time, particularly on rings. Sometimes it will appear as just I-N-R-I, sometimes as Jesus, sometimes as Ihesus, all kinds of variations of this. So these truncations of that longer term phrase. But rather than just being some kind of outward dedication of faith, and this ring dates to the 12th, 13th century, proclaiming that you were Christian in the 12th, 13th century, not a particularly outrageous thing to do, it's a fairly common belief system. The interpretation of a lot of these inscriptions is that they were actually seen to have protective powers. Adding the inscription to the ring wasn't just telling everybody you were a Christian, it was actually providing a form of additional protection to yourself. It was an apotropaic device added to the ring. And that's where the blue glass on this ring as well becomes quite interesting, because sapphires in the medieval world were often thought to have similar apotropaic protective qualities. And maybe what we see here is some sympathetic connection with the shiny blue sapphire that somebody obviously couldn't afford or couldn't get hold of, but the blue glass is maybe acting in that way and they're feeling some form of secondary, as I say, sympathetic protection from it. So the materials that objects are being made from do obviously go far beyond their pure metallic value, their status, the economic value that we often ascribe to them, to go into more symbolic and magical connections as well. Even when we get into things like medieval Christianity, where we often don't perceive magic and superstition to be a big part of belief, there is lots of evidence that this is in some ways quite different to the modern faith that many people would experience today. And a quick mention of coins. Hammered silver medieval coins in particular are very, very common finds that we see coming up, particularly through metal detecting, and indeed the finding of hammered coins, often known as hammies by the metal detecting community, are almost a rite of passage. It's something that newly starting metal detectorists will often talk about, that finding a hammered coin is something that's very much on their bucket list. But we don't always get them being recorded with us, because there seems to be a popular myth that Treasure Trove doesn't want to see individual coin finds. And it's true that often individual coin finds will be disclaimed as treasure and returns. But obviously, we do want to see them, we do want to record them, because quite clearly the distribution patterns of single coin finds can turn out to be quite significant, not only on a national level, looking at the way coinage is being used, but also on a more local level. Obviously, if a field has been well detected and each detectorist is individually finding a handful of individual coins here or there, the cumulative effect of those can actually build up to perhaps identifying, a previously unknown commercial market site or something like that. So we do obviously want to see individual coins being recorded. But secondly, identifying rare and unusual coins is quite a specialist act. So while most of these coins will turn out to be fairly normal, the special ones, the rare ones, the unique ones, aren't easily identifiable in the field and aren't easily identifiable without specialist knowledge, which I don't profess to own myself. But we like to show them to the people who do. And so just to show an example of that, on the right there, the silver cut 8 of William the Lion. Pennies of William the Lion, not that particularly unusual. Cut 8 themselves, not particularly that unusual. If you're aware of the cutting of pennies, obviously when you have a currency that's actually based on the precious metal value, of course, you can turn a penny into an 8 by cutting it, slice it again into a quarter, you have a farthing. So we do get this physical slicing of coins. But that particular coin doesn't look too different to any normal ones, but it is in fact only the second example of its type known. So obviously we're very pleased to see that, to record it. That's now in the National Museum of Scotland collections. So yeah, the recording of coins, of individual coin finds, definitely of significance. Then light on finds and grouping under connectivity. There we go. Rather nice little 7th century gold Merovingian tremesis. The tremesis is a really interesting currency. It comes out of the late Roman world. Basically, the last Roman coin standard in the Western Empire was the gold solidus. The tremesis represents a third of a solidus, the tre, maybe referred to the 3. But a nice bit of evidence of the Roman world after the supposed collapse of Rome. We can't go into now, but we often see it in terms of apocalyptic change and collapse and doom, but there are systems that continue. There is continuity into the early medieval period, and the use of Roman coin systems across Western Europe in the early medieval period, such as the tremesis, are evidence of that continuity. This particular one found at Coldstream, but Scotland is an unusual place to find these tremises. Their distribution patterns are normally southeastern England. Kent produces the most of them, and then kind of up through Lincolnshire and about up to the Humber, and anything north of the Humber they call unusual. So while we absolutely can't say that this coin doesn't represent direct contact between the Scottish borders and other parts of Europe, it's more likely that this is something that has travelled up from England, and then perhaps even loses its value of a coin. It takes on perhaps a different value and status as something coming from these different cultural landscapes, and then being transplanted into a new lowland Scottish one. So it's interesting to think about how these coins change their meaning perhaps as they travel. It's also worth saying that despite it being an unusual find for Scotland, it was actually a very, very rare type of tremesis that was found. So whether that was something recognised at the time or it's only rare to us because of the selection we have, we don't know. When this was found and put in the papers, there was a little piece in the Scottish Daily Mail in 2014 that said it may look like a bit of half-chewed rivet, which I think is a very, very unkind way to say it. It's a very attractive coin. It's just also some sympathy for the tremesis for the way it was abused. But for historical conspiracy theorists, this long-lost coin is a real piece of buried treasure. Now, what that was referring to was the fact that, you probably all know this already, honestly, but the Merovingians were apparently the ones who inherited the blood of Christ. This is the Da Vinci Code theory that they're trying to go with. So, just a nice reminder, as I'm sure you all know, that no matter what information you put out, particularly to the media, you never entirely have control over what the narrative is going to be. But they recognised it was important, so, you know, we should thank them. Another find, this Florentine florin, found at Roxburgh, minted in Florence in 1323. Again, not all finds are made by metallotetris. This was actually a garden find, so a rather stunning one to come across while sorting out petunias. I found about 4 miles away from Roxburgh Castle, so perhaps some connection with that site. It kind of fits in with the heyday of the castle, but still a few miles away. But again, evidence of the international connectivity, particularly of coinage. It doesn't necessarily suggest that somebody at Roxburgh Castle or the vicinity was trading directly with northern Italy, because the florin became basically the international coin of banking and accountancy at the time. The production and the quality of the gold in Florence was such that it was the internationally trusted coin. To the point that some of the English kings actually got quite jealous and started trying to ban it and set their own and getting very weird about it. But it didn't stop it. For centuries, the florin became the trusted international currency. So a nice bit of point of again, connection and connectivity to the international banking scene, rather than seeing areas as being isolated, fully connected economically with European-wide financial systems. And of course, the name florin as well stuck as a name for a coin of high value and trusted worth. It continues right up until the Victorian period and beyond. Well, it becomes silver, which is interesting, but beautiful coins when they come up. And then just to finish, to talk about an ongoing find, because everything I've spoken about so far, of course, has been finds that are completed and done and nicely housed away in museums. The Peebles hoard, which some of you may have heard of, came up in 2020, so it was a lockdown find. Originally made by the metallotetris you can see on screen, Marius Stepien, who deserves a lot of credit for the way he acted, because the information we have about the hoard is entirely due to his actions, to him finding material and recognising that he'd come across something quite significant, stopping instantly and calling up the Treasure Trove unit, who then went out to excavate alongside colleagues from National Museum Scotland, and that led to the preservation of a huge amount of information that would otherwise have been lost. So we like to criticise and point out where things have been done wrong. It's also very important, I think, to point out where things have been done right and to use that to promote future good practice. So Marius was brilliant in the whole process. The hoard, you can see here, kind of during excavation, due to it being, before it was lifted, it had to be block lifted and excavated and allowed to protect it. That's where the process is at the moment. It's undergoing excavation, it's undergoing cataloguing and analysis. That's not a quick process, so there's no huge update from me except to say kind of watch this space. There are fascinating bits of material inside the hoard. There are bits and pieces that at the moment don't seem to have parallels. There are traces of surviving wood and leather in the hoard. So it's fair to say this is a hoard of intense significance, but in due course, as more analysis is done, there will be more coming out to say what is being found. So please do look forward to that. Another plug for Sketchfab again, which is the home choice. When it was in situ in the ground, before it was block lifted, my colleague Hugo Anderson Weimark did a 3D scan. So again, you can go. The link here is an absolute horror show. But if you go onto Sketchfab and search National Museum Scotland, you will find this and many other really interesting 3D scans. But you can see the hoard in situ, have a look at some of the significant pieces and zoom in and out. So an interesting way to explore while you wait for more details of the analysis to come forward. Otherwise, thank you very much.